The story begins in the dying light of the western frontier, where Silas the Serpent Blackwood has already become more myth than man, a whispered name traded in saloons, a warning told to drifters, and a curse muttered by lawmen. His legend was born in blood and betrayal, shaped by the lawless territories that raised him. The mere mention of his name carries a chill, as if the dust itself remembers the sound of his gunfire. Silas earned his moniker not only for his ruthless efficiency, but for the cold patience with which he struck, silent, sudden, and deadly. Some say he was born cruel, others that the world carved the mercy out of him. Whatever the truth, the legacy he left behind was undeniable. His hands had pulled the trigger on men who deserved it and some who didn't. He'd robbed banks with a precision that made the Pinkertons curse. His name and dismantled rival gangs with the cold calculation of a man who trusted no one, the ruthless outlaw, the relentless pursuit, and the violence that followed him like a storm. But behind every legend lies the man, and Silas was no exception. Beneath the black coat and calloused hands lived a man haunted by ghosts he refused to name. His crimes weren't just acts of greed. They were fueled by pain, born from a youth spent under the whip of a cruel stepfather and a lifetime of watching justice fail those too poor or powerless to claim it. The world had taught him one lesson: mercy was weakness, and weakness was fatal. Now, years later, the world is closing in. Every outlaw's story ends one of two ways, the gallows or the gun, and Silas feels both waiting. His gang has splintered. Old allies have turned to enemies. The law, once distant and disorganized, is tightening its noose with each passing month. Pinkerton agents ride in pairs now, and wanted posters reach farther than ever before. There is nowhere left to hide. Each night, Silas camps beneath the stars and feels the weight of silence pressing on him. The crackle of his fire is the only sound that reminds him he's still alive. The others, the men he rode with, are gone, buried in shallow graves across the territories. Their ghosts whisper in his dreams. He remembers their faces, young, reckless men who believed in gold and glory. He remembers how they laughed before the gunfire started and how they never laughed again. Those memories cling to him like dust in the creases of his coat. In his solitude, Silas begins to realize something he's never allowed himself to feel: the slow suffocation of a man running out of road. His name, once a source of pride, now feels like a curse echoing through every town, every whisper. He cannot step into a saloon without the air changing. Mothers pull their children close, and men reach instinctively for their holsters. The hunter has become the hunted. As dawn breaks over the desert, Silas stands by the ashes of his campfire, staring into the horizon. His reflection in a steel flask looks older than his years, eyes hollow, jaw tense, the lines of violence carved deep into his face. Somewhere in that emptiness lies the faintest flicker of something else, a longing he can't yet name. A sense that the life he's built on blood can no longer sustain him. But for now, the serpent moves on, silent and solitary, his shadow stretching long across the barren land, a man trapped between legend and damnation, unable to tell which is worse. The night was heavy with rain and the scent of smoke, the kind of night that blurred the line between past sins and present regrets. Silas the Serpent Blackwood rode through the storm with his hat pulled low, the brim dripping water down the sides of his face. He had been riding for days, hunted and hollow, following no road but the one that led him farther from his past. The once feared outlaw was now a ghost among the living, a shadow on horseback. When his horse stumbled on a muddy trail deep in the canyon pass, Silas was to take shelter. He followed the faint glow of lantern light that flickered through the trees, a light that shouldn't have been there. A small cabin stood in the clearing, smoke curling faintly from its chimney. Its windows glowed with warmth, a rare thing in a world that had long since turned cold to him, cautious. Hand resting on the revolver at his hip, Silas dismounted. The rain soaked him to the bone as he approached. He expected a trap, or at least suspicion. What he didn't expect was her. The door creaked open before he could knock, and a woman stood there, pale in the lamplight, eyes steady despite the fear that flickered behind them. Alara. She couldn't have been more than 30, dressed plainly but with a kind of quiet grace. Her hands were rough from work, her expression calm but cautious. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice soft yet firm, not trembling, not pleading. "Shelter," Silas said simply. "Just for the night." Her gaze lingered on the gun at his side, then on the weariness etched into his face. "I don't take kindly to strangers," she replied. "Neither do I," he muttered, and something in his tone made her lips twitch in the faintest hint of a smirk. After a long moment, she stepped aside. "You can come in, but mind your manners." Inside, the cabin was modest, a single-room dwelling with a stove, a table, and a pile of quilts folded neatly in the corner. It was small but warm, filled with the scent of wood smoke and herbs. Silas stood awkwardly near the door, dripping rainwater onto the floor. "You're welcome to dry off by the fire," Alara said, turning back to her work at the stove. "There's stew, if you're hungry." He hesitated, unused to kindness, especially from strangers. "I can pay," he offered gruffly. "I didn't ask for payment," she said without turning. "Only that you don't bring trouble here." Her words hung in the air like smoke. Silas knew he carried nothing but trouble. As the night deepened, silence filled the room, the kind of silence that stretches, testing patience and trust. Silas ate quietly, his eyes flicking off into the door, always measuring distance and escape. Alara moved about her space without fear, but not without awareness. She had seen danger before. He could tell by the calm steadiness in her hands. At one point, their eyes met. Just for a moment. In hers, Silas saw no judgment, only tired understanding. It disarmed him more than any gun could. Later, when thunder rattled the windows and the fire burned low, Alara offered him a blanket. "The floor's all I have," she said. He took it with a quiet nod. "You trust easy for someone living alone." "I don't," she replied. "But sometimes kindness is the only thing keeping the dark away." Her words struck something deep inside him, something that hadn't stirred in years. As he lay awake that night, staring at the flickering shadows across the ceiling, he realized that for the first time in a long while he wasn't thinking about escape. He was thinking about the sound of her voice, the steadiness of her hands, and the strange calm that had settled over him in her presence. Alara, unknowingly, had begun to chip away at the walls he'd spent a lifetime building. The storm outside raged on, but inside that small cabin, something fragile and unfamiliar began to take root, the faint, hesitant echo of connection. Morning came quietly to the canyon, the world washed clean by rain. The sun broke through low-hanging clouds, turning the mist into silver ribbons that drifted between the trees. Silas Blackwood awoke to the smell of wood smoke and bread baking. The cabin was still small, still fragile-looking against the wild land around it, but something about it felt different. For the first time in years, he'd slept without one hand resting on his revolver. Alara moved quietly about the room, her presence calm and steady, like the world didn't know her peace, but she made it anyway. Silas watched her from the corner of his eye, uneasy at the way her simplicity unsettled him. He was used to fear, to anger, to deceit. But this quiet decency felt like something dangerous, something capable of breaking through armor he'd spent a lifetime forging. When she handed him a plate of food, he muttered his thanks, almost begrudgingly. Alara smiled faintly but said nothing. Her silence unnerved him more than any lawman's threats. As the days passed, Silas found reasons to linger. The horse had thrown a shoe, he claimed. The trail was still flooded. The truth was simpler. He didn't want to leave. Each morning he chopped wood for her stove, repaired a fence post, fetched water from the creek. He told himself it was only to repay her hospitality. But when she smiled her quiet, knowing smile, he stopped pretending even to himself. Still, the old instincts never fully left. One afternoon, when two strangers passed near the cabin, rough men with the kind of eyes that weighed and calculated, Silas's hand went straight to his gun. His voice was low, sharp, ready for blood. But Alara stepped forward before he could draw. "They're just passing through," she said calmly, her tone as firm as stone. "No need to turn the world to violence every time it stirs." The words struck him harder than a bullet. He lowered his hand, the moment of choice hanging in the air like smoke. The men moved on, unaware of the battle that had just raged inside him. When they were gone, Silas stared at his shaking hand, a hand that had killed more men than he could count, and realized for the first time that restraint could feel heavier than pulling the trigger. That night, he sat by the fire, turning Alara's words over in his mind. She spoke of people like they were worth saving, even the broken ones. "You can't outrun what you've done," she told him, "but you can decide what you do next." Silas had spent a lifetime believing men didn't change. They only learned to hide their sins better. But Alara's faith, as stubborn as it was gentle, made him wonder if maybe she was right. Her world was smaller than his, a cabin, a garden, a stretch of sky, yet she lived as though each sunrise was a promise worth keeping. Little by little, Silas began to act without thinking, small. Human gestures he wouldn't have imagined himself capable of. When Alara cut her hand chopping vegetables, he wrapped it carefully, his rough fingers trembling as they brushed hers. When a storm tore part of her roof loose, he spent the night hammering it back in place, soaked to the bone but silent, driven by something he couldn't name. Each small act chipped away at the man known as the Serpent, and though Silas didn't yet understand it, these were the moments that began to remake him. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Alara glanced up from her sewing and said softly, "You don't have to keep looking over your shoulder here." He met her gaze, something fragile flickering behind his eyes. "Old habits die hard," he muttered. "Only if you feed them," she replied, her tone light but her meaning deep. Silas turned back to the fire, its light reflecting in his weary eyes. He realized that for the first time, the world didn't feel entirely against him. Something had shifted, not in the land, not in the law, but inside him. The violence that had once defined him still lingered, a beast pacing in its cage. But now there was another force, quiet, patient, and infinitely stronger, teaching him that maybe, just maybe, redemption wasn't a lie. And as the flames danced across the walls, Silas allowed himself to imagine a life not bound by blood or bounty, a life where kindness wasn't weakness. But survival. The peace Silas had found in Alara's cabin was fragile, too fragile for a man with blood on his hands and a bounty on his head. Days of quiet work and soft conversation had lulled him into believing the past could be outrun. But the past doesn't fade for men like Silas the Serpent Blackwood. It waits, patient, hungry. It began with a sound, the distant echo of hooves against hard earth. Silas froze mid-step, the bucket in his hands tipping, water spilling onto the dirt. He knew that rhythm. Men who rode like that weren't travelers or traders. They were hunters. He looked up toward the ridge where three riders appeared, silhouettes against the setting sun. His blood ran cold. Old comrades, now scavengers of the man he used to be. Their leader, Jeb Calloway, had been his right hand once before greed and betrayal tore their partnership apart. Jeb was meaner now, harder, his eyes holding the same venom Silas had long since tried to bury. "Well, I'll be damned," Jeb sneered as he dismounted. The serpent himself, tamed by a woman and a patch of dirt. Ain't that a sight? Silas's hand drifted toward his gun but stopped halfway. He wasn't that man anymore, or at least, he was trying not to be. Elara stepped out of the cabin, standing tall despite the danger. The wind whipped her hair, but her eyes were calm, unwavering. "She's got no part in this," Silas said evenly. "Oh, I reckon she does now," Jeb said, smirking. "You know how it is, can't leave witnesses when there's a price that high on your head." For a moment, the world shrank to silence. Silas could hear only the rustle of the grass and the slow, steady thump of his heart. Every instinct screamed at him to draw, to kill, to survive. But then he saw Elara, the woman who had believed in him when no one else dared, standing there with a quiet faith that had disarmed him far more than any weapon could. She didn't plead or shout. She simply said, "You don't have to do this." It was enough. Silas drew, not with panic, but with purpose. The fight was brutal and short, every motion born of experience, every shot deliberate. When the smoke cleared, 2 of the riders lay dead, and Jeb staggered back, wounded, disbelief clouding his eyes. "You always were a fool," Jeb hissed. "You think you can just wash it all away?" Silas's jaw tightened. "No," he said quietly, "but I can choose what I do next." He lowered his gun, the choice that defined him more than any victory ever had. Jeb stared at him, then stumbled toward his horse, vanishing into the gathering dusk. The moment the danger passed, Silas dropped to one knee, the adrenaline draining from him like blood. Elara ran to his side, pressing a hand against the cut on his shoulder. He winced but didn't pull away. "You didn't have to protect me," she whispered. "Yes, I did," he said. "For once in my life I had something worth protecting." The law would come soon, the gunfire would see to that. He knew the price of his choice. But as he looked at Elara, he felt no regret. The man who had once burned every bridge for survival now stood ready to build one, even if it cost him everything. That night, as the flames of a hastily built fire flickered against the walls, Silas sat in silence. The ghosts that had haunted him, the faces of those he'd wronged, the echoes of violence seemed to fade into the darkness. He had faced them not with rage, but with resolve. For the first time, he'd chosen to defend, not destroy. And though the law's lanterns glimmered faintly in the valley below, drawing nearer with every passing moment, Silas felt lighter than he ever had. The serpent had shed its skin. Whether the dawn would bring freedom or death no longer mattered. What mattered was that when the darkness finally caught up to him, he would meet it not as the outlaw the world had made him, but as the man Elara had helped him become. Dawn came softly over the horizon, pale gold spilling across the valley, washing the land clean. The gunfire, the shouts, the chaos of the night before were gone, leaving behind only silence. Smoke still curled from the dying fire near the cabin, its embers glowing like faint memories refusing to die out. Silas Blackwood sat on the porch steps, his hat resting beside him, his right arm bound in a blood-stained bandage. The pain was sharp but distant. What lingered more deeply was the ache of realization that for the first time in years, he had nothing left to run from. The lawmen had come at dawn. They'd found him waiting, unarmed, unflinching. Elara had begged him to flee, her eyes glistening with tears, but he'd only shaken his head. "Running's what made me the man I was," he said. "It's time I stopped." Sheriff McCade, a man who'd once ridden with Silas in their reckless youth, had stared at him for a long, quiet moment before lowering his weapon. "You're either a damn fool or a changed man," the sheriff muttered. "Maybe both," Silas replied. Instead of chains, they offered him something he never expected, mercy. The truth of the fight had spread fast. Even the townsfolk who once whispered his name like a curse now saw a different man. He defended an innocent woman, not for gain, but for good. There would still be trials, reckonings, debts to pay, but the sentence was no longer death or exile. It was a chance at life. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of the ranch returned. The wounds healed slowly, but the scars remained reminders of what he'd lost and what he'd chosen to save. Silas took to repairing fences, mending roofs, helping travelers who passed through. It wasn't redemption in the grand, glorious sense. It was quiet, humble, and real. One evening, as the sun melted into a sea of crimson clouds, Alara found him by the river where the willows grew. She knelt beside him, her hands brushing the cool water. "You ever think about leaving all this behind?" she asked softly. Silas gazed out over the horizon, endless plains stretching into forever. "Once," he said, "but not anymore. This is where I stop running." Alara smiled faintly. "And if your past finds you again?" He turned to her, the faintest glint of warmth in his eyes. "Then I'll face it the same way I faced it before, only this time I won't be alone." The wind carried their laughter across the fields, blending with the rustle of wheat and the chirping of crickets. It wasn't a perfect life. The world still remembered Silas the Serpent Blackwood, outlaw and murderer. Some wounds could never be undone. But in the quiet of their small world, in the rhythm of the earth, the warmth of shared silence, and the bond that had weathered violence and fear, there was peace. At night, Silas often sat beneath the stars, the revolver still by his side, though it was more relic than weapon now. The weight of it reminded him of who he had been and how far he'd come. Alara would join him sometimes, resting her head against his shoulder. Together, they watched the night sky stretch wide and unbroken, a canvas of forgiveness painted in silver and shadow. "You think men like you can ever truly change?" she asked one night. Silas took a long breath, eyes tracing the constellations. "Maybe not all at once," he said, "but piece by piece, with someone to believe in, Em? Yeah, I reckon they can." A coyote howled in the distance, lonely but alive. Silas listened, a faint smile touching his lips. He had spent a lifetime fighting ghosts, chasing redemption through gun smoke and blood. Now he found it not in running or fighting, but in staying, in loving, in living quietly beneath a wide, forgiving sky. As the first light of morning crept over the plains once more, Silas rose to his feet and looked east toward that new horizon. The past might always cast its shadow, but for the first time, the man who had once lived in darkness walked toward the light, slow, steady, unafraid. Because even the darkest souls, he had learned, can still find their dawn. Years passed quietly after the dust had settled on Silas Blackwood's story. The world moved on, as it always does, with only faint whispers of the man who had once been called the Serpent. In nearby towns, children grew up hearing two different tales, one of a ruthless outlaw who painted the frontier in blood, and another of a man who found salvation in love and sacrifice. The truth, as always, lived somewhere in between. The Blackwood Ranch became a place of quiet legend. Travelers passing through spoke of a weathered old cowboy who lived there with his wife, tending horses and offering food to any wanderer who came his way. Few ever recognized the name, and those who did never spoke of it. Time, it seemed, had chosen mercy. Alara still moved through the world with the same calm grace that had once disarmed the most dangerous man in the West. Her hair had turned silver, but her eyes held the same quiet fire. She spent her days tending the garden, her evenings by the fire with Silas. Together, they had carved a life not built on fear, but on simple acts of care, mending fences, nursing stray animals, sharing what little they had. One winter morning, Silas stood by the porch rail, the first light of dawn painting his face gold. His hands, once used to draw guns, now held a steaming cup of coffee. The land before him stretched wide and silent, his kingdom, his penance, his peace. Ilara joined him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "You've been quiet this morning," she said softly. Silas smiled faintly, his eyes distant. "Just thinking," he murmured, "about how far a man can travel without ever leaving the same patch of earth." Ilara tilted her head, amused. "And where has that thinking taken you?" He turned toward her, the lines in his face deep but gentle. "To you," he said. "Always back to you." They stood in silence for a long while, watching the sun climb higher. The snow glittered like a field of diamonds, and the wind carried the faint scent of pine and smoke. Later that spring, when the wildflowers returned, Silas didn't rise from his sleep one morning. He passed quietly, peacefully, no violence, no fear, just the stillness of a man who had finally outrun the shadows of his own making. The townsfolk buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch, beneath the same wide sky he had once cursed and then come to love. His headstone was simple: Silas Blackwood, a man redeemed. Ilara visited that hill every day until her own passing years later. She would bring a single wildflower and hum an old tune, the same one she had sung the night they first met. Under the glow of lantern light in that forgotten cabin, when people spoke of them afterward, they didn't talk about the outlaw or the scandal. They spoke about a man who changed, who found forgiveness where none should have been possible, and love where none was deserved. And as the years rolled on, the land they had tended grew lush and alive. The ranch became a refuge for the lost and the weary, a place where people said you could still feel the warmth of two souls who had taught the world that redemption isn't found in forgetting the past, but in choosing every day to be better than the man you were. And on the quietest nights, when the wind swept across the plains, some swore they could still hear a man's low laugh carried through the grass, the sound of the serpent finally at peace beneath the endless, forgiving sky.